Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for hanging on there with us. We are glad to be getting started today on this fall manufacturing webcast series event. I'm Jason Gumpert, and I am joined today by Scott Hamilton of Columbus. We are really lucky to have Scott with us. He's an industry solution architect and a Microsoft MVP for Dynamics AX. Scott's also a longtime contributor to MS Dynamics World as a columnist and as a presenter at several of our past events. We are really glad to have him back again. As you also may know, Scott's a leading author of books on the Dynamics AX product line and has released 2 recent books focused on AX 2012. We will also be giving away copies of those to attendees today at the end of the session. We'll pick winners who are still live on the session, so stay tuned for that at the end. And as we get started, I just want to also add that we do invite you to add your feedback today, to ask questions, to share your point of view. During Scott's presentation, you can use the chat that you see in the upper part of the, on the right side of the screen, as well as the Q&A block that you should see there to ask your questions. We'll also be tweeting a bit throughout the event, so you can use the hashtag MSDWMFG or MSDW Manufacturing to share your point of view if you'd like. So without further delay, please allow me to introduce Scott Hamilton.
Thank you very much. Today, I'd like to try to cover something called manufacturing best practices using Dynamics AX. It turns out, from an agenda point of view, I'd like to do a quick definition of what my focus will be on the manufacturing best practices. In particular, I'm focused on the prescriptive business processes embedded in the ERP package, in this case, AX. And it turns out with each release of AX, which reflects the Microsoft Accelerated Development Strategy, there's some dramatic impacts on the AX functionality and the resulting impact on business processes. So after we're all done looking at this, then the issue is how can I best use prescriptive processes to help re-engineer how I run my business, and how do I help my people adopt them? And I'll do a slight summary and then shift to a Q&A session. My intent is to run for about 30 minutes. By the way, the photo at the top of this slide represents somebody kayaking. It's part of our corporate branding here at Columbus, but since I do a lot of kayaking, this picture could be me kayaking in Alaska. There'll be several other photos I'll try to highlight. In terms of the definition of manufacturing practices, I'd like to try to focus a few things. And by the way, this particular picture is it's a picture of us at the Columbus headquarters in Copenhagen, Denmark. We went out for a coffee break here at lunch, and this is a picture of us at lunch. But in terms of best practices, if you actually go to Google and look up something called manufacturing best practices, you get 14 million hits. A similar large number reflects also best practices in supply chain management and ERP software. Now, this represents some dramatic increases relative to a study done in 2006. One of the articles that I read out of the 14 million, I didn't get through all 14 million of them. But this particular article kind of did the number of hits at that point in time on similar topics, and we've seen a dramatic expansion in the references to best practices. Now, they actually, when you talk about best practices, it keeps it changing based on the context of the author and what they're looking at. So I'd like to keep mine very narrowly focused, and this is the use of prescriptive business processes that are already embedded in the ERP software, in this case, Dynamics AX. Further, I'd like to even limit this to my area of expertise, which tends to be supply chain management and manufacturing firms, both discrete and process. And I've tried to take into account this prescriptive business processes in some of the recent books I've written about AX 2012, but also some of the rapid value initiatives that I've been part of at Columbus. And I'll come back to these examples later in the speech. Now, there's some factors that I mentioned. Microsoft has had an accelerated development strategy for AX. And with each release, there's changes in software functionality that impact what I'd call the prescriptive business processes. And there are companies also involved with lean manufacturing initiatives, which also impact some of these prescriptive approaches. And I'll be touching on those lean manufacturing initiatives later in the presentation. So let's take a look at what's going on with AX. Now, I've been involved with AX for approximately 8 to 9 years. So it dates back to AX 3.0. And this, basic graphic is trying to show that with each release of AX, we're seeing a number of new features. And in terms of my metrics of trying to measure the percent change affecting supply chain management, we're seeing a 10 to 20% incremental change with each release. And this has been accelerating with each release. Now, my analysis of this percent change is actually based on, the books I've been writing about AX. Going back to 2002, I wrote one of the textbooks for the field by McGraw-Hill, which tried to incorporate, my 25 years of experience at the time, plus about 1,000 firms that I worked with. And part of that book was trying to give you a theoretical viewpoint of what these prescriptive business processes look like. The thing is, as you move from theory to actual functionality within an ERP package, the functionality starts to constrain or, let's say, support what you can do. But each ERP package has its own terminology and embedded conceptual models. And so I've focused on that in terms of Dynamics AX. Now, as I wrote the most recent books, I've tried to focus on specific industries, such as discrete manufacturing and food products, but they reflect a shift from a previous book, where Managing Your Supply Chain was a book I wrote about AX 2009. It primarily focused the case studies on discrete manufacturing. And as I wrote the next version of that discrete manufacturing book for 2012, I tried to incorporate these prescriptive business processes that I'm referring to. And I'll be showing you examples. The same with process manufacturing. It changed from 2009 to 2012, and in terms of the book content, the food products book, obviously all the case studies, about 100 of them, focus on just food products. But the topics also apply to different scenarios like chemicals or other process manufacturers. So, by the way, this detailed analysis of what has changed, I've documented in some previous articles I wrote for MS Dynamics World. So, March 1st, for example, there was an article that came out on changes in process manufacturing, and most recently, last month, the changes in discrete manufacturing. Now, I'm going to just show you a summary of those articles. It's way too much detail, but I want to use it just to highlight a few key things. This is called a heat map of new functionality, where I'm using a page count of what I've covered in my books to compare what was the previous functionality versus what's the new functionality. Now, the new functionality in this case is represented by AX 2012 versus previous is AX 2009. And 2012 came out last summer. However, there's a new release called R2, which is now coming on the market December 1st. Using the color coding, the blue indicates here's the incremental changes in 2012, and in the maroon color, there's some additional incremental changes as you move to R2. Now, I'm not going to do a detailed analysis of this, but as you can see that item definition has changed significantly. The changes in resources and routings has changed significantly. There's a new configuration technology within AX 2012 for configured items. And there's almost a total change in for lean manufacturing and the use of Kanban orders. But overall, this represents a 20% change in the embedded conceptual models within AX. If I take a look at the same or similar heat map for the book on process manufacturing, we're seeing changes in 2012 and also the new R2, where the total amount of change is about 15% change in the embedded conceptual models. So what we're trying to do is let's take advantage of this tremendous investment that Microsoft is putting into AX. And so how, what are some of these impacts? Well, now we do have more options on how to model our business processes. And for those of us that are AX professionals, there is a learning curve on this new functionality. The previous diagrams and these articles that I've written have tried to help quantify that how much learning is there for somebody who's an AX professional. Now, there's also some other impacts. I'm working with several people who are just in the midst of implementing AX, and the new release of R2 all of a sudden creates some decisions about should we use R2 or should we use AX 2012, which is maybe the focus of what they're trying to implement. But for existing users, there's this whole evaluation of how applicable is the new functionality and what's the impact on the existing business processes. Many of the current users are trying to make decisions about when and how to upgrade to 2012. It is a significant effort just because of all the significant changes within the functionality of AX. Now, I'd like to cover a few examples of this concept of the embedded conceptual models and prescriptive business processes that I've talked about. I'd like to start with purchase order processing. One of the reasons why is for many manufacturers that's a very large percent of their cost of goods sold. And if you really do improve supply chain management, there's a tremendous bottom line impact, such as reduced inventories of these materials and even reduced costs associated with materials. Now, I'm also going to try to cover several other examples. Sales and operations planning tends to be one of the it's in the top 5 of why companies fail in their ERP implementation, or if not fail, at least don't get their benefits that they were hoping to get. So I'd like to try to talk about that business process and what are the impacts of some of the new functionality in AX. I'd also like to talk about a multi-company supply chain and the impacts of some new functionality, and then obviously the total change in lean manufacturing. So let's jump in to purchase order processing. This represents a business process model using the standards for trying to diagram it, which consists of several swim lanes for each role. Just starting on the left-hand side, we have the purchasing agent performing some activities, the receiving clerk, the accounts payable clerk, and the quality control clerk. Now, there's actually kind of 7 steps to a typical business process. I'm going to be talking about these 7 steps. But let me start with what amounts to what should be the first step, firming a planned production order. By the way, when you look at the Class A users, they have about a 95 to 99% hit rate that all purchase orders for trade goods are triggered by firming up a planned purchase order. I mean, this represents the game plan that is being used to drive and coordinate all of the supply chain activities within a company. By the way, in other words, the exception should be you manually create a purchase order. So that's kind of the basic 7 steps. I'll pick this example. When this is somewhat unique or a bias towards the AX functionality. You register the arrival of a purchase order in order to capture various details, such as the lot number or serial number, or the details of which pallet you might be putting it on. And if it does require testing, there's a capability of AX to automatically generate a quality order, which tells the quality people which test has to be performed and allows them to report actual results of the test. And if they pass the test, you finish updating the receipts. Otherwise, you have to handle the rejected material. So let's take a look at one change that was introduced with 2012. With 2012, it added a new step to this business process called confirming a purchase order. Until you confirm a purchase order, you cannot do any of the other subsequent steps. There's another change in 2012, which is the purchase order approval process for manually created purchase orders. In other words, as a general rule for trade goods, you do not go through a PO approval process, but it is feasible to do. In which case, when you initially create a PO, it might be in draft status. As it goes through the review process, it's called the in-review status, and finally it is approved, and at which point in time you can confirm it. So let's take a look then on these two little impacts on purchase